Poliventure. It's our continuing workshop. I started this in the summer for my political science students, and now I've broadened it a bit to basically introduce it to more folks, given its popularity with my students. And at the first 8 weeks of the fall semester, a lot of students were watching the recordings from the summer and wanting to talk about it. So I figured, why not take it to the next level and bring it into a live stream. So I'm quite excited about that. Let me go ahead and walk us through it. So about this workshop, right? So Poliventure is a workshop series that explores how games relate to concepts in political science. And I'll be live streaming games like Catan Universe or Risk or Sid Meier's Civilization, and discussing how different elements of the game relate to political science. Now these workshops will be live streamed on Twitch, and it'll be on Wednesdays from 7:30 to 8. And you can obviously go to poliventure.com to watch the live stream. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that, to do so. And I'll click on this so you can take a look at what this appears like. And apparently it's not letting that load, but just know that it'll redirect you to ipolisci.com, and you'll be able to see it here. And then any recordings will be included below the summer. So as a heads up, there are some recordings available which introduce the workshop and walk through the 7 concepts in some detail. I'll go ahead and review them today as well, but I'll be adding to this as we go forward, just so you get a sense of what's going on. Okay, so I'll go ahead and close that, or get us back to the PowerPoint. Okay. And just so we're clear, like some people ask, like, political science, what's that? I think you're like, my brother studied it or something. Political science is the scientific study of who gets what, when, where, and how. It is what I have my master's in PhD in, and I'm an assistant professor at Cuyamaca Community College in East San Diego County, California. I've been here since spring of 2019, and I'm really happy to be at a community college setting, having been a former student at a community college. And having some experience working in state and federal politics, I was happy to go back to school, get my advanced degrees, and then be a professor at a community college. It means a lot to me to be able to return to that setting. So what I like to do is to basically introduce students to the discipline of political science. And a couple of suggestions that came to me over the first year, 2 years or so, were like, hey, do you game, and do you play board games, or do you play video games? I'm like, I used to when I was younger, but not so much anymore. Basically, grew up, got married, had a kid, and it takes most of my time. But I'm happy to report that I am introducing my son Ethan to the world of games. We have a few that we play: 60 Second City, Settlers of Catan. We found this new one called Gods Love Dinosaurs. And he's just having a blast. So it's nice to be able to have a friend, right? Someone, my son, who I can introduce him to these things. So I'm quite excited by that. Now you might be asking, okay, what's our schedule for the fall? So it'll start this Tuesday, or excuse me, I should say Wednesday. I'll have to update this text here because I'm off on the schedules, but just know that it's Wednesdays, and I'll update this for next time. So this week we'll talk about the 7 concepts, and then the following 7 weeks we'll go into more detail for each of those concepts. So communication, information, strategy, and so on. And if you're interested, you can obviously see the recordings from the summer session, which I did during June, July, and the beginning of August, if you're interested. And again, this is a live stream on Twitch. And you can go to poliventure.com, which will redirect you. And you can also, go on twitch.tv and check it out as too. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into week 1, the concepts. The 7 of them, I should say. So our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First, you'll be able to list the 7 concepts. Secondly, you'll identify 2 values of each concept. Third, you'll explain how a concept can be operationalized. And then lastly, you'll describe how concepts can be illustrated by games. And I'll use Untitled Goose Game as an example of how we can look at concepts from a game's point of view. All right, so let me go ahead and turn this back on the full screen for the slides so it'll show up a little better. So our 7 concepts: communication, information, strategy, moves, network, probability, and signals. And so you might be asking, how did you come up with these concepts? Well, as I studied public policy as an undergraduate student working on my associate's degree and my bachelor's degree, I started to think about what politics was and to develop these models in my mind of how politics worked. After I graduated from UC Merced, I ended up I transferred from Cerritos Community College and then graduated from UC Merced. Went to go work in the state capitol for then Lieutenant Governor John Garamendi, and I was able to get right in the thick of politics and to learn about it from one of the state's most venerable politicians. And I worked for him for 5 years. So halfway through my time with him, he decided to run for Congress, and I went back with him to Washington, D.C. to work from 2009 to through 2012. And in those 5 years, I just got practical real world experience about politics, about networks and how you can make moves in a legislative process. The information environment that we worked in, how people use press releases and press conferences and other documents to send signals, how things were likely to happen, the probability of a bill passing, whether it was high and low, and all these general ideas. So these were stewing in my mind, right? They're working through it. And then I decided to go back to school to get my master's and PhD in political science. And one thing that getting those degrees at least helped me with was understanding more generally the abstract nature of politics. These general ideas that specific things relate to. So for example, if you watch the president give a speech, you might be looking at key words or concepts that he says, or you might just ask, what's the point? What is he getting to? And you'll typically see that in your nightly news or on a late night comedy show. You'll get the punchline from the reporter or from the comedian. But if you listen to that whole press conference of the president, you'll be able to see that there's more than that punchline. And so the way you get to that seeing more is having general ideas. And so the general ideas here are communication, information, strategy, moves, network, probability, and signals. So let me go ahead and walk through each of these, and then I'll demonstrate it, illustrate it with an example from Untitled Goose Game, and then we'll call it a day. So here's the first of three tables of our concepts. So first is communication, as you see here. And there's two values to communication. There's direct communication and there's indirect communication. And this operationalization column basically says, how does this look in the real world, right? So we have a concept, an idea of communication, and we have values of it, direct or indirect. And then the question is, how does it look like, right? How do you operationalize it into reality or into the the physical mental space that we live in? And so direct would be talking to another player directly. So say you're playing a board game and there's another player across from you, and you can say, hey Chris, what do you think of this move I'm gonna make? Even though he might be your opponent, right? That's a direct communication. Indirect is talking to another player through yet another player. So an example would be, say you're three of you are playing the board game Risk. You, Ramon, and Chris. And what can happen is I tell Chris something, and then Chris will tell Ramon something, right? And that was my hope, is that Chris would communicate what I told him or parts of what I told him to Ramon. And now you have a sense of indirect communication, right? Because I'm not talking directly to Ramon, I'm talking to Ramon through Chris. So that's the concept of communication. Next is information, right? So this can be complete or incomplete. So complete, basically you see all the actions of all the players. There's essentially no fog of war, right? There's no outer part that you can't see unless you move in that direction. When you see a full board game, you get a sense of what's going on. The standard example is Monopoly, right? You see the Monopoly board, you see where everyone's token is, you see how much money they have unless they're hiding it under the board or in their hand or pocket or something. You see where their hotels are and the like. So that is a game of complete information because you can see everything that's going on and there's nothing hidden from you. Now, incomplete information is where you can't see all those things, right? So an example of this would be one of the live streams I had a couple days ago, which was called Catan Universe, hidden tiles or desert tiles. And basically there's part of the board game that you can't see, right? That there's a fog of war. But as you play the game, that those hidden parts of the game are revealed to you. So that would start off as an incomplete game, but then transition over to a complete game. Okay, let's move on to the next two concepts. The first one here is strategy. And I notice here that my video is covering part of what I'm trying to point out, but note that behind me is information, and then behind me on this next slide is moves. So our third concept is strategy, and it can be either cooperative strategy or competitive strategy. So cooperative strategy is where you work with other players to accomplish a goal. So an example of this would be the new board game that my son and I got, which is called 60 Second City. We think we found it at Target or something. And it basically says, here's a board. You have to put these tiles in some kind of pattern based on the cards that are shown to you, and you need to do it together with whoever else is playing, and you have 60 seconds to run through the cards that are face up and see how quickly you can work through it. And you have 4 or 5 rounds in order to get through the stack of cards that you've been assigned, and hopefully you solve all the puzzles. And if you don't, well, then you lose as a team, right? You don't lose individually. So that'd be an example of cooperative strategy, because we need to work together. Now, competitive strategy is where either you're working alone or instrumentally with other players to accomplish goals. So competitive means I want to win, and the only way I can win is if you don't win, right? There's no win-win scenario typically in competitive strategies. You're taking your actions based on strategies with the intent of winning over an opponent, whether it's a other person or it's the computer or the like. Most of the times we're fascinated with competitive games. So an example, real life example would be playing soccer. Like you're on one team, the other person on the other team. Obviously your goal is to score goals so that you would win. That'd be a competitive type of strategy. The next concept is moves. And there's 2 types. There's simultaneous and sequential. So simultaneous moves, it's where you move at the same time as other players. I think this is pretty straightforward. Examples would include games like basketball or soccer, board games, not too many that are simultaneous. A lot of video games are simultaneous. So if you play things like Counter-Strike or other first-person type games, they're typically simultaneous, where you're moving while the other players are moving. Sequential are when you take turns with other players. So I go first, you go second, someone else goes third, someone else goes fourth, and so on. So pointing back again to the game Catan Universe, you would see that you're taking sequential moves, right? Everyone has different turns. Another way of thinking about simultaneous is real-time games, while sequential are turn-based games. Okay. Let's go ahead and jump to the last 3 concepts, network, probability, and signals. So for network, the values are either simple or complex, right? So simple networks essentially have fewer objects and players, while complex networks have more objects and more players. Simple network might be your family, right? You, in this case for my family, it's me, my wife, and my son. So there's 3 of us in this network. If I wanted to make it more complicated, I would bring in my in-laws. I would bring in my parents. If I want to make it more complicated, I bring in my sister-in-laws, my brothers. If I want to make it more complicated, I bring in my aunts and uncles. And if I want to make it more complicated, I bring in my cousins, and then so on and so forth. So you can see how a network can start simple, but it can become more complex over time. Next is probability, and there's high and low values, right? A high probability is the likelihood of a random outcome is higher, so the chance of it occurring is higher, while a low probability is the likelihood of a random outcome being lower. So, for example, if you flip a coin, right, you have an equal probability of getting heads or tails, right, 50-50. If you roll a dice and it has 6 sides, you have an equal probability of rolling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. But if you roll 2 dice, then your probability of a 1 or a 12, rolling a 1 or a 12, or excuse me, a 2 or a 12 is the same, but your probability of rolling a 7 is much higher than rolling a 2 or a 12, given the number of combinations that two 6-sided dice can produce. So you have higher probabilities, lower probabilities of things. Lastly, it's signals, and your signals can be more clear or less clear. A more clear signal is representative of strategy. A less clear signal is not representative of strategy. So another way of thinking of signals is like bluffing. You see this a lot in like national poker tournaments, like different players have glasses on, or they wear hoodies, or they're shrouded in some kind of mystery. And if you play them 1, 2, or 3 times, you don't know how they're sending signals. But if you're on that poker circuit and you see the same players over and over and over again, you'll see that their signals, like when they're bluffing and when they're not. Right, when the signal they're sending is clear of their action that they're going to take, or it's less clear of the action they're going to take. And then what happens as things get a little more complicated, you find out that, oh no, they changed it up on you because they realized that you knew that what their strategy was, and then they update it to kind of throw you off what you were expecting. So all in all, these are the 7 concepts that we'll be exploring over the next 7 weeks. And I'll go ahead and ask this question, right, which is, how can concepts be illustrated by games? And here's a set of games that I might use to illustrate these concepts over the next 7 weeks. I haven't decided exactly which ones. I think it might just be based on what I'm interested in or what's going on. And the short answer, the short 2 bullet point answer is, how can concepts be illustrated by games is that most of us are used to playing with games, right? We grow up and we learn how to play, with the ball. And then we learn that we can either bounce this ball, or we can kick this ball, or we can throw the ball, or we can catch the ball. And you're playing with like a game, right? As a child. And therefore, it, you're like, in Major League Soccer, you're in the NFL, you're in the WNBA, like you're now a professional athlete. Right, but you started off playing a game, and then that game turned into a profession. So games are when we were younger are like toy models, right? And they help us illustrate these concepts of playing in a team, of competing against another team, of developing plays, developing strategies. And so games can illustrate these concepts because it kind of makes it in their essential, right? It makes it clear as to what is being asked of you. The second reason why concepts can be illustrated by games is because games are just simplifications of reality, right? And even sometimes reality is a game. Most people will say something like, oh, politics is all just games, or these politicians are playing games, or you might hear even politicians using language like, oh, this is all just a game. We're going to resolve these differences by, before the deadline and things like that. And so know that this is part of the experience. And we try to simplify reality in political science to illustrate things and more clearly to our audience, whether it's fellow political scientists, whether it's students, whether it's the general public, whether it's policymakers and the like. Being able to distill something to its essence is quite a skill, and so games help us do that. Okay, so with that, I was going to go ahead and shift to a discussion, but what I like to do is pull up the Goose Game, and we'll let the Goose Game, when I read about this, I was just cracking up. So let me make sure that my audio's on. I think it is. And I'll go ahead and play the trailer / gameplay example for Goose Game. So you're watching this 1 minute trailer and you're like, what? How can this illustrate any of those 7 concepts that I brought to your attention? Well, note that this is the trailer for their 2-player version of their game, right? And if you paid close attention to the 2 geese, you saw that they would that they weren't fighting it out, right? They weren't like squawking at each other and like, being angry and like feather fighting and things like this. What they were doing is they were working together, right? So if you think, oh, what's one of those concepts that we brought up, right? One of them is, strategy. Is your strategy going to be cooperative or is it going to be competitive? So with this new update to the Untitled Goose Game, what they're adding is a second type of strategy, right? A cooperative type of strategy when you work with another goose to accomplish your rampage through the hamlet of some country. And so I'm quite excited to be able to explore these games and demonstrate how they relate to concepts. And then what you'll see is we'll have we'll play the game for a little bit. I'll talk about the concept, play a game for a little bit, and then I'll show you a real life example, right? In the current events, in the current what's going on in either California politics, U.S. politics, or international politics, to say like, here's this concept, here's how this game like illustrates it, and this is all fun and exciting. And then let's look at a real life, real world example of how this is happening, so that we can see this connection between idea, our toy model, our toy game, and then the real life, real world. So with that, I appreciate you taking the time to listen in. If there's anyone around, we'll have a discussion, but I'll stop streaming for that. And again, thank you for your time. So take care, and I'll see you next week.